A woman at my daughter's school has a tattoo of my husband's name. We've been married 15 years. I noticed the tattoo during the spring carnival at Maplewood Elementary. My daughter Sophie was 6 years old and obsessed with the ring toss. Determined to win a stuffed dinosaur despite having terrible aim, I stood behind her, offering encouragement, while she launched plastic rings that bounced off bottles with disappointing consistency. The woman running the booth bent down to retrieve fallen rings, and her sleeve rode up enough to reveal script on her inner forearm. The name was partially visible at first, just enough letters to make my brain start assembling possibilities. Then she reached further, and the full name appeared in elegant cursive: Julian, my husband's name. Not a common variation or similar spelling. Julian, exactly as I'd written it on our marriage certificate 15 years ago. My first reaction was to dismiss it as coincidence. Julian wasn't the most common name, but it wasn't rare either. Plenty of people had that name. The woman probably had a brother or father or son named Julian. I smiled politely when she handed Sophie another set of rings and tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in my stomach. But I kept glancing at the tattoo, at the way the letters curved across her skin in a distinctly romantic script. This wasn't the blocky memorial font you'd use for a deceased family member. This was the delicate, flowing style women got when they were in love. The woman was probably in her late 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and freckles across her nose. She wore jeans and a Maplewood Elementary volunteer t-shirt, laughing warmly when kids missed their tosses. She looked completely normal, like any other parent volunteering at a school carnival. Nothing about her suggested she'd have any connection to my husband. Julian worked in software development and spent most of his time at our house or his office downtown. He coached Sophie's soccer team on weekends. He made pancakes every Sunday morning. He was predictable and stable and utterly devoted to our family. There was no way this woman's tattoo meant what my paranoid brain was suggesting. Sophie finally won her dinosaur on her 8th attempt, shrieking with joy and hugging the purple plush toy to her chest. I congratulated her and steered us toward the cotton candy stand, trying to shake off the weird feeling. But my eyes kept drifting back to the ring toss booth, watching the woman with the auburn hair laugh and high-five successful kids. I told myself I was being ridiculous. My marriage was solid. Julian had never given me a reason to doubt him. We'd been together since college, married for 15 years, raised a beautiful daughter who adored us both. This tattoo was a coincidence. It had to be. That night, after Sophie went to bed, I sat on the couch next to Julian while he scrolled through his phone. I tried to focus on the book I was reading, but kept thinking about that tattoo, the elegant script, the placement on her inner forearm where she'd see it constantly, the romantic styling that suggested intimacy rather than family connection. I set my book down and asked Julian if he knew anyone at Sophie's school besides the teachers we'd met at conferences. He glanced up from his phone and said no. Why would he? I told him I'd seen a volunteer today who looked vaguely familiar and wondered if maybe she was connected to his work. Julian shrugged and said he doubted it. Most of his coworkers didn't have kids at Maplewood. I let it drop because I didn't know how to articulate my concerns without sounding paranoid or accusatory. How do you ask your husband if he knows a woman who has his name tattooed on her arm? The question itself felt like an accusation, so I stayed quiet and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. But that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Julian slept peacefully beside me, wondering why my instincts were screaming that something was wrong. I'd always trusted my gut, and my gut was telling me that tattoo meant something, I just didn't know what yet. The next morning, I dropped Sophie at school and found myself walking past the main office, glancing at the volunteer schedule posted on the bulletin board. I scanned the names looking for anything that might identify the auburn-haired woman from the ring toss booth. The spring carnival had required dozens of volunteers, and the sign-up sheet listed names organized by booth assignment ring toss had been staffed by 3 people: Melanie Cho, David Reeves, and Bethany Voss. I pulled out my phone and typed each name into social media, searching profiles until I found her: Bethany Voss, 38 years old, divorced, mother of a second grader named Connor. Her profile photo showed her smiling in hiking gear on some mountain trail. I scrolled through Bethany's publicly visible posts, looking for any mention of Julian. Nothing obvious appeared in her recent photos or status updates. Lots of pictures of her son, some hiking posts, a few jokes shared from other pages. She seemed completely normal, just another single mom doing her best. I felt guilty for internet stalking her based on nothing but a tattoo, but I couldn't shake the need to understand. I clicked through her photo albums, going back months and then years. Most of her photos showed Connor at various ages, with occasional appearances by what looked like her parents or siblings. No Julian anywhere that I could find. Then I reached an album from 7 years ago titled Happy Times, and my breath caught in my throat. The photos showed Bethany younger and happier, her arm around a man's shoulders at various locations: beach shots, restaurant dinners, a hiking trip to some national park. The man's face was visible in every photo, and I recognized him immediately despite the years that had passed. Julian looked different with longer hair and no beard, but it was definitely him. His smile, his posture, the way he stood with his weight slightly favored to his left leg because of an old soccer injury. That was my husband in photos with another woman 7 years ago. I sat in my car in the school parking lot, staring at my phone screen with my hands shaking. 7 years ago, Sophie would have been about 8 months old. I'd been on maternity leave, exhausted and overwhelmed with a colicky baby who barely slept. Julian had been working long hours on a major project at his company, often staying late or going in on weekends. I remembered feeling isolated and lonely, like I was raising our daughter alone while he focused on his career. But I'd never suspected he was doing anything except working. The possibility of an affair had never crossed my mind because Julian wasn't that kind of man, or so I'd believed. The photos were dated across several months in a timeline that made me feel physically sick. January through April of that year, Julian and Bethany had apparently been together enough to document it extensively. Beach trips and dinners and hikes, all while I was home with our infant daughter, thinking my husband was grinding away at the office. The betrayal felt like being punched repeatedly in the stomach. I scrolled through every photo in the album, memorizing details and dates. The last photo was dated April 23rd, showing them at some restaurant with wine glasses raised to the camera. Bethany's caption read, "Celebrating us," with a heart emoji. I needed to leave the parking lot before I broke down completely. I started my car with trembling hands and drove home on autopilot, barely registering traffic or street signs. My brain kept showing me those photos on loop. Julian's arm around Bethany's waist, Julian kissing her cheek while she laughed, Julian looking at her with the same affection he showed me. I pulled into our driveway and sat there trying to figure out what to do next. Confronting Julian felt necessary but terrifying. What if he denied everything? What if he got angry and turned this around on me for snooping? What if he admitted it and our marriage shattered? I went inside and paced around the kitchen, trying to calm down enough to think rationally. The affair had happened 7 years ago. Based on those photos, Julian and I were still married. He'd never mentioned Bethany or acted suspicious or given me any reason to think he was still involved with her. Maybe the affair had ended after those photos stopped. Maybe it was ancient history that had nothing to do with our current life. But then why did Bethany have his name tattooed on her arm? That wasn't the kind of thing you kept if a relationship ended badly. That was permanent commitment, eternal declaration of feeling. Unless the tattoo predated the photos, which seemed unlikely given the freshness of her skin in those pictures. My phone rang and Julian's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, trying to keep my voice steady. He asked if I could pick up his dry cleaning on my way to get Sophie from school, said he had an important client meeting tomorrow and needed his good suit. I agreed automatically, the normal mundane request feeling surreal given what I'd just discovered. Julian thanked me and said he'd probably be home around 6, that he loved me. I managed to say I loved him too before hanging up, then immediately felt disgusted with myself for maintaining the charade. I spent the afternoon in a fog, picking up dry cleaning and collecting Sophie from school, making snacks and helping with homework. Sophie chattered about her day while I nodded and made appropriate responses, my mind completely elsewhere. I kept thinking about those photos, about the timeline of deception. 7 years ago, while I was sleep-deprived and struggling with postpartum depression, Julian had been building a whole separate relationship, taking beach trips and romantic dinners while I sat at home with our crying baby, feeling abandoned and alone. The cruelty of it made me want to scream. Julian came home at 6:15 with Chinese takeout and a smile, kissing my forehead and asking about my day. I said it was fine and helped him unpack containers of lo mein and orange chicken, watching him interact with Sophie like nothing was wrong. He asked about her spelling test and listened attentively while she described the playground drama involving her best friend. He was being exactly the husband and father he'd always been, warm and engaged and present. The dissonance between this version of Julian and the man in those photos made my head hurt. After dinner, while Julian gave Sophie her bath, I went into our bedroom and opened his laptop. He never kept it password protected at home, trusting me completely with access to everything. The irony wasn't lost on me as I opened his email and started searching for Bethany's name. Nothing appeared in his inbox or sent messages. I tried variations of her name and searched for her email address from the social media profile, but came up empty. Either he'd been careful to delete everything, or they'd communicated some other way. I checked his text messages next, scrolling back through months of conversations. Nothing from Bethany, though I noticed he'd deleted several message threads entirely based on gaps in the date sequence. I opened his photos and started scrolling, looking for anything that might connect to her. Most of the recent pictures showed Sophie or family trips or work-related snapshots. I kept going back further, month by month, until I reached photos from 7 years ago. There were pictures of newborn Sophie that I'd taken, hospital shots and first bath photos, but interspersed among them were photos I'd never seen. Julian and Bethany at what looked like the same restaurant from her Facebook album, Julian and Bethany on a hiking trail. Julian and Bethany in someone's living room I didn't recognize. The bathroom door opened, and Julian's voice called out that Sophie was ready for her bedtime story. I closed the laptop quickly and went to read Sophie her favorite book about a dragon who was afraid of heights, my voice shaking slightly on words I'd read 100 times before. Sophie didn't notice, too absorbed in the illustrations. After I tucked her in and kissed her goodnight, I found Julian in the kitchen loading the dishwasher. I stood in the doorway watching him hum while he rinsed plates, trying to reconcile this domestic scene with the evidence of his betrayal. I couldn't do it anymore. The pretending felt like it was suffocating me. I walked over and asked him directly who Bethany Voss was. Julian froze with a plate in his hand, water still running over it. He set it down carefully in the dishwasher and turned off the faucet before looking at me. His face had gone carefully blank in a way that told me everything I needed to know. He asked where I'd heard that name, his voice too casual. I told him about the tattoo at the carnival and the Facebook photos and the pictures on his laptop. Julian's face crumbled, and he sat down hard at the kitchen table. He didn't deny it. That was the first shock. I'd expected excuses or deflections or outright lies, but Julian just put his head in his hands and said he was sorry. The affair had happened 7 years ago, during the worst period of our marriage, when I'd been struggling with postpartum depression, and he'd felt shut out and alone. He'd met Bethany at a work conference, and one thing led to another, over several months. He swore it had ended before Sophie's first birthday, that he'd chosen our family and never contacted Bethany again. He said he'd been carrying the guilt ever since, trying to be a better husband to make up for his betrayal. I asked about the tattoo and why Bethany would have his name on her arm if the relationship had ended 7 years ago. Julian looked confused and said he didn't know she had a tattoo, that they'd broken things off abruptly when he'd decided to recommit to our marriage. I asked how abruptly, and he admitted he'd essentially ghosted her, stopped returning calls and texts, avoided places he might run into her, cut off all contact without really explaining why I felt a flash of sympathy for Bethany despite everything, imagining how that must have felt. Then I remembered she'd been sleeping with a married man, and the sympathy evaporated. Julian reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I asked if he'd known Bethany's son attended Sophie's school. He looked genuinely shocked and said no. He had no idea she even had a kid. I told him Connor was in 2nd grade, which meant Bethany had been pregnant around the same time as me or shortly after. Julian's face went white, and he asked what I was implying. I said I wasn't implying anything, just stating facts. Connor was 7 or 8 years old based on his grade level. The affair had lasted through Sophie's first several months of life. The timeline was pretty fucking clear. Julian stood up abruptly and started pacing the kitchen. He said there was no way Connor was his son, that he'd been careful about protection with Bethany. I asked if he'd been careful every single time over several months of an affair, and watched him struggle to answer. He insisted he would have known if Bethany was pregnant with his child, that she would have told him. I pointed out that he'd ghosted her without explanation right around the time she might have discovered a pregnancy. Why would she tell him anything after that? Julian looked like he might be sick. I told him he needed to find out for sure whether Connor was his son. Julian argued that digging into this would destroy our family and hurt innocent people for no reason. I laughed bitterly and said our family was already destroyed. He'd taken care of that 7 years ago. The only question now was how many casualties his affair had created. Julian said he needed time to think, that we shouldn't make any rash decisions. I told him he had until tomorrow to figure out how to handle this, and if he didn't, I would contact Bethany myself. Then I went upstairs and locked myself in the guest bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark, replaying every moment of the past 7 years, looking for signs I'd missed. Julian had come home late from work throughout that period, but I'd never questioned it. He'd taken several weekend work trips that had seemed legitimate at the time. He'd been distant emotionally, but I'd attributed that to the stress of new parenthood and his demanding job. I'd been so focused on surviving Sophie's difficult infancy that I'd missed my husband building an entire relationship with another woman. The guilt mixed with anger in my chest until I couldn't breathe properly. Around 3 a.m, I heard Julian moving around downstairs. I crept to the guest room door and listened to him pacing and making quiet phone calls. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sounded anguished. Part of me wanted to go comfort him. Force of habit from 15 years of being his partner. The larger part wanted to throw something at his head. I went back to bed and eventually fell into restless sleep filled with nightmares about tattoos and wedding rings and children who looked like strangers. I woke at 6 to find Julian sitting on the edge of the guest bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept at all. He said he'd spent the night researching DNA testing options and thinking about how to approach this situation. He wanted to handle it carefully to minimize trauma for everyone involved, especially the kids. I appreciated that he was taking this seriously, but I also felt detached from his planning. This was his mess to clean up. I was just collateral damage trying to figure out if my marriage could survive. Julian said he'd located Bethany's address through an online search and wanted to go talk to her in person today. I told him I was coming with him. He started to argue that my presence would make things more confrontational, but I cut him off. If Connor was potentially Julian's son, that made him Sophie's half-brother. This affected our daughter directly, which meant I had every right to be part of the conversation. Julian reluctantly agreed and said we could go this morning after dropping Sophie at school. I nodded and went to take a shower, standing under scalding water, trying to wash away the sick feeling in my stomach. We dropped Sophie at school in tense silence, both of us forcing smiles and cheerful goodbyes. Then Julian drove us across town to an apartment complex, in a neighborhood I'd never visited. We parked outside Building C and sat in the car for several minutes, neither of us moving. Finally, Julian asked if I was sure I wanted to do this, and I said I'd never been less sure of anything, but we didn't have a choice. He nodded and we got out, climbing exterior stairs to apartment 214. Julian knocked and we waited. I could hear movement inside. Then the door opened to reveal Bethany in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, her hair damp from a shower. Her eyes went wide when she saw Julian, then widened further when she noticed me. She started to close the door, but Julian put his hand against it and said we needed to talk. Bethany's face hardened, and she told him he'd lost the right to talk to her 7 years ago when he'd vanished without explanation. Julian said he knew, and he was sorry, but this was important. It was about her son. Bethany's expression changed from anger to fear in an instant. She asked what we wanted with Connor, her voice rising. I stepped forward and introduced myself as Julian's wife, said we weren't here to cause trouble, but we needed to ask some difficult questions. Bethany looked between us with confusion and dawning horror. She asked how we'd found her, and I explained about the carnival and the tattoo and the timeline. I watched her process this, saw the moment she understood what we were asking. She shook her head and said no, absolutely not. Connor wasn't Julian's son. His father was her ex-husband from a relationship that had started after Julian disappeared. I asked when Connor's birthday was. Bethany hesitated, then said November 18th. I did the math in my head. 7 years and 5 months ago, which meant Bethany had gotten pregnant in February of the affair year, right in the middle of the timeline documented in those Facebook photos. I pointed this out gently, and Bethany's face crumbled. She insisted her ex-husband was Connor's father, that they'd gotten together in January, and married quickly when she discovered the pregnancy. Julian asked if her ex-husband knew about the affair, and Bethany said no. She'd never told him because it hadn't mattered. She'd been devastated when Julian ghosted her and had rebounded into a relationship with a coworker who'd always had feelings for her. Julian asked if she'd be willing to do a DNA test to establish paternity definitively. Bethany looked at him like he'd suggested setting her apartment on fire. She said no, absolutely not. Connor had a father, and it wasn't Julian. Doing a DNA test would destroy her son's entire understanding of his family and his identity. She'd built a life after Julian abandoned her, and she wasn't letting him come back and tear it apart. I understood her position, but I also thought about Sophie having a potential half-sibling she didn't know about medical history and genetic information that mattered, about truth versus comfortable lies. I asked Bethany about the tattoo, why she'd kept Julian's name on her arm if their relationship had ended so badly. She looked down at her forearm and touched the script gently. She said she'd gotten it right before Julian disappeared, as a surprise to show him how committed she was. When he'd ghosted her, she'd been too hurt and too broke to get it removed. Then she'd gotten pregnant and married, and the tattoo became the least of her concerns. She'd planned to cover it eventually but never got around to it. Now it was just part of her, a reminder of a painful time she'd survived. Julian said we weren't trying to disrupt her life, but if there was any chance Connor was his son, he deserved to know. Bethany laughed bitterly and asked what right he had to deserve anything after abandoning her. She said Connor had a father who'd been there for every birthday and soccer game and parent-teacher conference. A father who'd raised him and loved him even after the marriage fell apart. That man was Connor's real dad, regardless of biology. Julian said he understood that, but he still needed to know the truth. Bethany told us to leave. We stood in her doorway for another moment, neither of us moving. Finally, I asked Bethany if she'd at least think about it. Consider whether Connor might someday want to know his full genetic history. Whether keeping him in the dark was really protecting him or just protecting herself from uncomfortable truths. Bethany's eyes filled with tears, and she said she'd spent 7 years building a stable life for her son out of the wreckage Julian had left behind. She wasn't going to let him destroy that stability now. Then she closed the door in our faces. Julian and I walked back to the car in silence. He started the engine but didn't put it in gear, just sat there gripping the steering wheel. I asked what he wanted to do now, and he said he didn't know. Forcing a DNA test without Bethany's cooperation would require legal action, which would definitely destroy her life, and possibly ours too. But not knowing for sure whether Connor was his son would eat at him forever. I pointed out that it was already eating at him. Had been for 7 years, whether he'd admitted it consciously or not. The affair itself suggested something had been broken in our marriage. Maybe this was just the symptom becoming visible. Julian turned to look at me with devastation on his face. He asked if I wanted a divorce. I said I didn't know what I wanted except honesty. Finally, after years of secrets, he nodded and started telling me everything. The affair had started as an emotional connection at a work conference when Bethany had been assigned to his breakout session. They'd talked for hours about their lives and relationships, and he'd felt seen in a way he hadn't felt with me since before Sophie's birth. When the conference ended, they'd exchanged numbers and continued talking. The physical affair had started a few weeks later when Bethany had driven to our city for a weekend visit. He said the guilt had been immediate and overwhelming, but he'd kept going back because being with Bethany made him feel like himself again, instead of just a sleep-deprived parent. She didn't need anything from him except his company. Their time together was about pleasure and connection instead of divided attention and exhaustion. He'd known it was wrong and selfish, but he'd rationalized that he was being a better husband to me because the affair made him happier and more patient at home. Eventually, the cognitive dissonance had become too much, and he'd realized he was destroying our family. He'd ended things with Bethany by simply stopping contact because he hadn't known how else to do it. I asked if he'd loved her. Julian was quiet for a long time before saying he didn't know. He'd felt something intense and consuming, but whether that was love or just escape or a combination of both, he couldn't say. He said he'd loved me throughout the affair, that his feelings for Bethany hadn't diminished what he felt for our family. I told him that didn't make it hurt less. If anything, it made it worse. He'd chosen to betray me while claiming to love me, which meant love wasn't enough to keep him faithful. Julian flinched but didn't disagree. We drove home and spent the rest of the day in separate rooms, both of us processing. I kept thinking about Bethany's refusal to test Connor's paternity. Part of me wanted to respect her decision and walk away from this entire situation, let her keep her secrets and let Julian live with uncertainty. But another part of me thought about Sophie growing up, not knowing she might have a half-brother. About Connor potentially having genetic conditions we should know about truth being better than comfortable lies even when the truth was painful. I couldn't figure out which instinct was right. That evening, Julian asked if we could talk. We sat on the back porch while Sophie played in her room upstairs. He said he'd been thinking about why Bethany might be so resistant to DNA testing. And he had a theory. If her ex-husband had believed Connor was his biological son, and they'd built their family on that understanding, then revealing Connor wasn't his would destroy that man's relationship with his son. Not just for Bethany, but for Connor and his father. The DNA test had casualties beyond just the people taking it. Julian said maybe we needed to accept that some truths caused more harm than good. I asked if he could really live with not knowing whether Connor was his son. Julian said he didn't have a choice unless we wanted to pursue legal action, which would make us the villains in this story. I pointed out that we were already the villains in Bethany's story, had been for 7 years. Our moral standing was pretty questionable here, Julian agreed, but said adding more damage wouldn't improve the situation. I couldn't argue with that logic, even though it felt wrong to just walk away. We sat in silence, watching the sunset, both of us trapped in an impossible situation with no good options. Over the next few weeks, I struggled to find normal. Julian and I were in couples therapy trying to rebuild trust, but I kept thinking about Bethany and Connor. I'd see them occasionally at school pickup or events, and each time I'd study Connor's face looking for resemblance. He had dark hair like Julian and a similar build, but he also had Bethany's freckles and nose, and features that could have come from her ex-husband. There was no way to know without testing, and testing would destroy multiple families. The uncertainty ate at me constantly. Sophie started asking why mommy and daddy were sad all the time. I tried to hide my emotional turmoil from her, but kids sensed everything. Julian and I assured her we were fine, just dealing with some adult stress. She seemed to accept this, but started acting out at school, getting into fights with her best friend and refusing to do homework. Her teacher called to schedule a conference, concerned about the sudden behavior changes. I felt guilt crash over me. Our marriage problems were affecting our daughter exactly the way I'd feared. During a solo therapy session, I talked through the Connor situation with my counselor. She asked what outcome I actually wanted from DNA testing. I said I wanted to know the truth, but when she pressed me on what I'd do with that truth, I couldn't answer. If Connor was Julian's son, then what? Force a relationship with a child who'd never asked for this? Disrupt his life and his relationship with the father who'd raised him? Insert ourselves into Bethany's carefully constructed world? The more I thought about it, the more I realized Julian was right. Some truths caused more damage than they resolved, but I still couldn't let it go. I started driving past Bethany's apartment complex on my way home from errands, watching for her car or signs of Connor. I knew I was becoming obsessed, that this wasn't healthy, but I needed to understand who this woman was, why Julian had risked everything for her. One afternoon, I followed her to the grocery store and watched through the window as she shopped with Connor. They laughed together, picking out produce, Connor making jokes that made his mother smile. They looked happy and normal, completely unaware they were being observed by the wife of her former lover. I realized I was doing exactly what I'd accused Julian of doing during his affair, creating a separate reality disconnected from my actual life. Pursuing information that would only cause pain, I drove home and told Julian everything about following Bethany and watching Connor and becoming obsessed with a truth I couldn't change. Julian held me while I cried and said maybe we both needed to accept that this situation didn't have a resolution. Some questions didn't have good answers. Some mysteries were better left unsolved. 3 months after discovering the tattoo, I made a decision. I wrote Bethany a letter explaining that Julian and I wouldn't pursue DNA testing or contact her again. I apologized for showing up at her apartment and disrupting her life. I said I understood her desire to protect her son and respected her decision, but I included my contact information in case Connor ever wanted to reach out when he was older. In case he ever got the DNA test himself and had questions, I mailed it without telling Julian, needing to take some kind of action, even if it was just closing this door. Bethany never responded to the letter, and I didn't expect her to. But 2 weeks later, I saw her at school pickup, and she gave me a small nod. Not friendly, but acknowledging. We had an understanding now. She'd keep her secrets, and I'd keep mine. And we'd both protect our children from the consequences of adult choices. It wasn't forgiveness or resolution, but it was something. A fragile peace built on mutual recognition that some battles weren't worth fighting. Julian and I continued therapy and slowly started rebuilding our marriage. It wasn't the same as before, probably would never be, but we were trying. He'd proven himself willing to do the work of regaining my trust. I'd learned I could survive betrayal without falling apart completely. Sophie's behavior improved as the tension at home decreased. We settled into a new normal that acknowledged the fractures in our foundation while trying to build something sustainable anyway. On Sophie's 7th birthday, we threw her a party at a local park. She invited her entire class, which meant Connor attended with Bethany. I watched Julian interact with the boy, careful and distant, not showing any special interest that might raise questions. Connor played with the other kids without any idea his entire identity might be different than he understood it. I thought about how many families were built on secrets and convenient lies, how much of human life depended on believing narratives that might not be completely true. That evening after the party, Julian found me cleaning up wrapping paper in the living room. He asked if I'd noticed how much Connor laughed like Sophie. With that same snorting sound when something was really funny, I said I hadn't noticed and suggested we focus on the daughter we knew was ours. Julian nodded and helped me finish cleaning, but I could see the question still eating at him. The not knowing would probably haunt both of us forever. That was part of the price we'd pay for his affair and Bethany's secrets and all the choices that had led to this impossible situation. A year after I'd first seen the tattoo, I ran into Bethany at the grocery store. We ended up in the same checkout line and couldn't avoid acknowledging each other. She asked how Sophie was doing, and I asked about Connor. We made awkward small talk for several minutes before I finally asked if she'd considered covering the tattoo. Bethany looked down at her arm and said she'd thought about it but decided to keep it. Not as a memorial to Julian or their relationship, but as a reminder that she'd survived heartbreak and built something good anyway. The tattoo was proof of her strength now, not her pain. I understood what she meant in a way I wouldn't have a year ago. My own scars from this situation were invisible but permanent. They'd changed me and my marriage and my understanding of truth. But we'd survived too. Julian and I had built something new from the wreckage. Not the same as what we'd had before, but possibly more honest. We'd learned to live with uncertainty and unanswered questions. We'd accepted that life was messier than the clean narratives we wanted to believe in. Bethany paid for her groceries and turned to leave, then paused and said something that made my chest tight. She told me Connor asked about his tattoo sometimes, Why she had some man's name on her arm, she'd been telling him it was an old friend who'd died, someone important from before he was born. Eventually, he'd probably figure out the timeline didn't match and ask more questions. When that happened, she'd have to decide how much truth to share. But for now, she was letting him be a kid who didn't need to question his entire identity. I nodded, understanding that she was telling me Connor might someday seek answers we couldn't give him. That this situation wasn't resolved, just paused. Over the next few years, Julian and I settled into our rebuilt marriage. We had good days and hard days. Moments when the past felt distant and moments when it crashed over me like a wave. Sophie grew up with Connor in her class, the two of them becoming casual friends without any idea of their possible connection. I watched them interact at school events and wondered if biology called to biology somehow, if they felt drawn to each other because of shared DNA. But mostly they were just kids who happened to attend the same school, their lives intersecting randomly the way children's lives do. When Sophie turned 10, she asked why we didn't have more kids. Julian and I looked at each other across the dinner table, both of us thinking about Connor and the question we'd never answered. I told her some families were meant to be small, that we were complete just the three of us. Sophie accepted this easily. Not knowing her question had touched the rawest nerve in our marriage. That night, Julian held me while I cried for the family we might have, the brother Sophie might never know she had, the truth buried under layers of protection and fear. Connor turned 11 and Bethany threw him a party at the community center. Sophie was invited because her entire class was invited, and we attended despite the awkwardness. I watched Connor blow out candles while his father, Bethany's ex-husband, stood beside him with an arm around his shoulders. The man clearly loved his son. Regardless of genetics, he'd been there for every important moment of Connor's life. In every way that mattered except biology, he was Connor's real father. I realized then that DNA didn't define family as much as presence and choice and love. Julian had contributed nothing to Connor's life except possibly genetic material. The man standing beside that boy had earned the title of father through action. But I also saw how Bethany watched Julian throughout the party, her eyes following him with an expression I couldn't read, regret maybe, or curiosity about what might have been. She still had his name tattooed on her arm after all these years, still carried that permanent reminder of a relationship that had never been publicly acknowledged. I wondered if she'd told her truth to anyone, or if she carried the secret alone. If somewhere in her house were photos like the ones I'd found on Julian's laptop, evidence of a relationship that had existed and mattered, even if it had ended badly. Sophie asked me later why I'd been quiet at the party. I told her I was just thinking about how complicated life gets as you grow up, how relationships and truth and family all become more layered than they seem when you're young. She looked at me with confusion and went back to her video game. Still young enough that complicated didn't make sense. I envied her that innocence even as I tried to protect it, let her believe her family was simple and complete. Let her grow up without the weight of secrets and questions that had no good answers. On what would have been our 20th wedding anniversary, Julian and I went to dinner at the restaurant where he'd proposed. We'd made it further than I'd thought possible after the tattoo revelation. We'd survived betrayal and uncertainty, and the knowledge that some truths would never be fully known. Julian reached across the table and took my hand, thanking me for staying and fighting for us. I squeezed his hand back and said I'd chosen him again every day for years, even when it was hard. That was what marriage was, continuing to choose each other despite everything. But later that night, lying in bed, I thought about Bethany and her tattoo, about Connor growing older and possibly asking more questions, about Sophie having a potential half-brother she'd never know, about truth existing whether we acknowledged it or not. I'd made peace with uncertainty, but peace wasn't the same as closure. Some questions would remain open forever. Some wounds would never fully heal. That was the price of Julian's affair and the choices we'd all made in its aftermath. We were all marked by it permanently. Some of us literally, all of us emotionally. Years passed and life continued with its mixture of joy and pain. Sophie graduated from Maplewood Elementary and moved on to middle school. Connor did the same, his path and Sophie's diverging naturally as kids sorted themselves into different friend groups and activities. I saw Bethany less frequently, just occasional waves in parking lots or brief conversations at community events. The intensity of our shared secret faded into background noise, something we both carried but rarely acknowledged. Her tattoo remained visible whenever she wore short sleeves, Julian's name still written in elegant script, a permanent reminder of temporary love and lasting consequences, visible to anyone who looked but understood only by those of us who knew the full story. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.